This is station KCMT, broadcasting from somewhere in the Montana wilderness. Day 89 since everything changed. My name is Michael Turner, and if you're hearing this, then your radio still works and you're still breathing. That puts you ahead of most folks these days. I used to work emergency management down in Missoula. 23 years coordinating disaster response, natural disasters mostly. Floods, wildfires, the occasional blizzard that shut down the highways for a week. Never thought I'd be sitting in this old cabin, talking to empty air through a ham radio setup I cobbled together from spare parts. But here we are. The thing about emergencies is they usually have a beginning and an end. This one just keeps going. Started back in February when the hospitals began filling up with patients nobody could diagnose properly. I remember those first reports coming across my desk. Unusual respiratory cases, they called them. Doctors were scratching their heads because the symptoms didn't match anything in their textbooks. I was still working out of the county emergency office then. Still believed the system would handle whatever this was. We'd handled bird flu scares, that Ebola thing a few years back, even some anthrax letters that turned out to be hoaxes. This felt different from the start, though. The health department folks were nervous in a way I'd never seen before. The first real case I heard about was at St. Patrick Hospital. A woman in her 40s came in complaining she couldn't breathe right. Chest x-rays showed something growing in her lungs that shouldn't be there. Gray, web-like structures spreading through the tissue. The doctors thought it was some kind of cancer at first, maybe environmental exposure to something toxic. Then more patients started showing up with the same thing. 5, then 12, then 27 in a single week, all with that same gray growth in their chest cavities. The medical examiner, Dr. Emily Brooks, she was the first one to figure out what we were really dealing with. Found out it wasn't cancer at all. It was fungal. Emily was a straight shooter. Worked with us on a few cases over the years involving environmental hazards. When she called me that Tuesday morning in March, her voice had this edge to it I'd never heard before. She'd been studying tissue samples from the patients, running tests that took weeks to process. What she found kept her awake for 3 straight days. The fungus was something called Cordyceps, but it had changed somehow. In nature, this stuff only infected insects, ants mostly, taking over their nervous systems and making them climb to high places before it killed them. Emily's samples showed it had somehow adapted to human lung tissue. Not evolved naturally, she said. Adapted in a lab somewhere. That's when things started getting weird with the bureaucracy. Emily tried to publish her findings, wanted to alert other medical facilities about what they were dealing with. Her research got classified overnight. Federal agencies started showing up. Guys in suits who wouldn't tell you their names or which department they worked for. Emily got reassigned to some desk job processing paperwork. But she kept digging on her own time. Found out the first patients had all received medical equipment from the same supplier, a company called Meridian Biotech up near Kalispell. Surgical instruments, breathing apparatus, stuff that gets sterilized and reused across multiple facilities. Emily traced the contamination back to a research facility where Meridian was conducting some kind of pharmaceutical trials. The official story was that Meridian had been studying fungal compounds for new antidepressant medications. Natural brain chemistry enhancers, they called it. Turns out they were doing live human trials with modified Cordyceps extracts, testing how it affected neurotransmitter production. The volunteers thought they were getting cutting-edge treatment for severe depression. Something went wrong during one of those trials. A containment failure, Emily thought, though she never got access to the facility records. Infected equipment got sent out to hospitals before anyone realized what had happened. By the time the first patients started showing symptoms, contaminated instruments had been used in procedures across 4 states. The worst part was how long it took for people to get sick. Unlike other infections that hit you fast, this one was patient. Spores would sit in your lungs for weeks, slowly establishing themselves in the tissue. You'd feel fine, maybe a little tired, maybe a slight cough you'd blame on the season changing. Meanwhile, that gray web was spreading through your chest cavity. I remember the day Emily showed me her final report, the one that never got filed officially. We met at a diner outside town, someplace where she figured nobody would be listening. She looked like she hadn't slept in a month, kept checking over her shoulder every few minutes. She had photographs, microscope images of lung tissue samples. Even without medical training, you could see something was terribly wrong. The fungus wasn't just growing randomly. It was following specific pathways through the respiratory system, targeting the areas that control breathing reflex. Patients stayed conscious and aware, but their lungs slowly stopped working properly. Emily estimated that from first exposure, people had maybe 6 to 8 weeks. That was when I started preparing to leave Missoula. Not because I was panicking, but because I'd seen enough disaster response to know when a situation was beyond local control. The federal agencies were already setting up roadblocks on the highways, calling them health checkpoints. Facilities that had handled contaminated equipment were being quietly evacuated and sealed off. The official story was that everything was under control, just precautionary measures while they investigated this rare infection. But I was getting reports from other emergency coordinators across the region. Similar cases popping up in Spokane, Bozeman, Great Falls. Always the same pattern. Medical facilities first, then spreading to anyone who'd been treated there recently. I tried to get Emily to come with me when I packed up and headed for my uncle's old cabin up here in the mountains. She said she had to stay, had to keep documenting what was happening. Said somebody needed to maintain the record of what really went down. Last time I talked to her, she was coughing pretty badly herself. That was 6 weeks ago. The evacuation of Missoula wasn't announced officially. They just started closing down government offices one by one, claiming budget issues or facility maintenance. Schools got shut down for an extended spring break that never ended. The hospital stopped accepting new patients, then closed entirely. Most people didn't understand what was happening until it was too late to leave. I drove out on a Thursday morning in April, took Highway 2 west toward the mountains. The checkpoints were already up, but they were waving locals through without much scrutiny. I think the guys manning those roadblocks knew what was coming and didn't want to stick around either. Half of them looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The drive up here was the longest 40 miles of my life. Past other cars pulled off on the side of the road, doors hanging open, nobody around. At first I thought maybe people had mechanical trouble, but when I stopped to check one of them, I found the driver still sitting behind the wheel. Just sitting there, staring straight ahead, breathing in this slow, labored way. When I tapped on the window, he turned to look at me, and I could see gray patches growing along his neck and jaw. That's when I understood this wasn't going to be like other emergencies. There wasn't going to be a recovery phase where we'd rebuild and move on. This thing was going to keep spreading until there wasn't anyone left to spread to. The cabin belonged to my Uncle Ray, who passed away about 10 years back. It's got solar panels, a decent well, and it's 20 miles from the nearest neighbor. I figured if I was going to wait this out, better to do it somewhere the spores couldn't reach me easily. Brought enough supplies to last through winter, along with all the radio equipment I could carry. First few weeks up here were quiet. I'd monitor the emergency frequencies, listen to the news broadcasts from Billings and Helena. Everything sounded normal on the surface, weather reports, traffic updates, local sports scores, but you could hear the strain in the announcers' voices. Radio stations started going off the air without explanation. Just static where there used to be music and talk shows. The internet went dark sometime in May. Cell towers stopped working a week later. Ham radio became the only way to reach the outside world, and even that was getting spotty. I started broadcasting daily updates, mostly for my own sanity at first. Figured if anyone else was out there, they might want to know they weren't alone. That's how I met most of the other folks I've talked to on these frequencies. People who got out early, who saw the signs, and made hard choices about leaving everything behind. We'd share information about safe routes, which towns to avoid, where you might still find supplies. Gradually, those voices started disappearing too. Now it's mostly just me talking into the microphone, playing some music I downloaded before everything went dark, and trying to maintain some kind of routine. The solar panels still work, the radio equipment still functions, and I've got enough food to last until first snow. If you're listening to this, if you made it this far, then maybe you're dealing with the same questions I am. How long do we keep going? What's the point of surviving if there's nothing left to survive for? I don't have good answers to those questions, but I keep broadcasting anyway, because somebody should maintain the record. Somebody should remember how it all fell apart. Tomorrow I'll tell you about Dr. James Whitaker and what he found in the CDC files before Seattle went dark. Until then, this is Michael Turner on KCMT, reminding you to keep your filters clean and your frequency clear. This is KCMT, day 95, and I promised you I'd tell you about Dr. James Whitaker. Well, yesterday afternoon I finally made contact with him, and what he told me is going to keep me awake for weeks. If you're just tuning in, find somewhere comfortable to sit, because this story is going to change how you think about everything that's happened. Whitaker reached out to me on the emergency frequency around 3 in the afternoon. His signal was weak, lots of static, coming from somewhere in the Seattle area. He said he'd been monitoring my broadcast for the past week, trying to work up the courage to respond. The guy sounded exhausted, like he'd been carrying a secret that was eating him alive from the inside. He told me he worked for the CDC, stationed at their Pacific Northwest field office. Not one of the big shots you see on television during health crises, just a regular epidemiologist who spent his days tracking flu outbreaks and food poisoning cases. The kind of unglamorous government work that keeps society running without anyone noticing. When the first Cordyceps cases started appearing in hospitals, Whitaker was assigned to investigate. Standard protocol for unusual disease clusters: interview patients, trace their movements, figure out the common source. He expected to find contaminated food or water, maybe some environmental toxin. What he found instead was a paper trail that led straight back to Meridian Biotech. The research facility where it all started was called the Cascade Neurological Institute. Sounds fancy, right? Turns out it was just a converted warehouse in an industrial park outside Tacoma, the kind of place where rent is cheap and neighbors don't ask too many questions. Meridian had been leasing the space for about 18 months, conducting what they called advanced pharmaceutical research. Whitaker managed to get inside the facility before the federal lockdown hit. What he saw there made him understand why his superiors were suddenly so interested in classifying everything. The Institute wasn't just studying Cordyceps, they were actively modifying it, using gene therapy techniques to make it more compatible with human brain chemistry. The official research proposal talked about developing revolutionary treatments for severe depression and anxiety disorders. They'd identified compounds in the fungus that could enhance serotonin production, theoretically providing relief for patients who didn't respond to traditional medications. On paper, it looked like legitimate medical research that could help millions of people. Reality was different. Whitaker found lab notes describing experiments that went way beyond what any ethics committee would approve. They weren't just extracting compounds from the fungus, they were growing live cultures and testing them directly on human volunteers. People who'd signed up thinking they were participating in clinical trials for a new antidepressant. The volunteers were mostly folks who'd exhausted other treatment options. People who'd tried every medication available, gone through multiple therapists, maybe spent time in psychiatric facilities. They were desperate enough to try experimental treatments, willing to sign waivers and assume risks because they'd run out of conventional options. According to the files Whitaker found, the early trials looked promising. Subjects reported significant mood improvements, increased energy levels, better sleep patterns. The researchers were excited about what they called breakthrough results. Some of the volunteer testimonials read like miracle cure stories. People who'd been suicidal suddenly feeling hopeful about life again. But the fungus was doing more than just affecting brain chemistry. It was establishing itself in the subjects' respiratory systems, creating those gray web structures that Emily had discovered during her autopsies. The researchers knew this was happening. Their notes describe it as an acceptable side effect of the treatment process. The breaking point came during a trial session in January. One of the volunteers, a woman in her 30s who'd been showing excellent psychological improvement, suddenly developed severe breathing problems during a routine checkup. Within hours, the fungal growth in her lungs had spread to the point where conventional treatment was impossible. Instead of stopping the trials and seeking medical help for their subjects, Meridian decided to cover up what was happening. They moved the dying woman to a private medical facility, told her family she was receiving specialized treatment for her depression. When she passed away 2 weeks later, they listed the cause of death as complications from pre-existing respiratory conditions. That should have been the end of it, but the contamination had already spread. Medical equipment used during the woman's treatment had been sent to standard sterilization facilities, then redistributed to hospitals across the region. The spores survived the cleaning process and found new hosts among patients who had no idea they'd been exposed to anything unusual. Whitaker traced the contamination pattern through medical supply records, surgical instruments, ventilators, monitoring equipment. All of it had been through the same facilities that handled Meridian's infected materials. By the time anyone realized what was happening, contaminated equipment had been used in procedures at dozens of hospitals. The cover-up went all the way to the top levels of government. Federal health agencies knew about the Meridian trials from the beginning. They'd provided oversight and funding through Defense Department contracts. When things went wrong, the priority became protecting the research program rather than public health. Whitaker showed me classified memos describing the outbreak as a contained industrial accident. Federal response plans focused on managing information flow and preventing panic rather than treating patients or stopping the spread. They actually delayed public health warnings because they were worried about the political implications of admitting government-funded research had caused the crisis. The most disturbing thing Whitaker found was a timeline document showing that officials knew the fungus would continue spreading for months after the initial exposure. They calculated infection rates, estimated casualties, mapped out which regions would be affected first. They knew thousands of people were going to die, and they chose to let it happen rather than admit their mistakes. By the time Whitaker tried to go public with what he'd discovered, it was too late. His access to CDC systems got cut off overnight. His supervisor told him he'd been reassigned to a data entry position processing routine vaccination records. When he kept pushing for transparency, he was placed on administrative leave pending a security review. That's when he decided to reach out to people like me. Whitaker figured if the government wasn't going to tell the truth, then someone else needed to maintain the record of what really happened. He'd managed to copy most of the relevant files before losing his access, storing everything on encrypted drives he'd hidden at his apartment. During our conversations over the past week, I could hear Whitaker getting sicker. His voice became rougher each day, interrupted by coughing fits that lasted longer than they should. He told me he'd probably been exposed during his investigation of the Cascade facility, but he was determined to get the information out before his condition got worse. Yesterday was our longest conversation, almost 3 hours of him walking me through document after document. Financial records showing payments to volunteer subjects and their families. Medical charts tracking the progression of fungal infection in trial participants. Email exchanges between Meridian executives and government officials discussing damage control strategies. The picture that emerged was of a research program that prioritized results over safety, backed by agencies that valued secrecy over public health. Whitaker estimated that if proper protocols had been followed, the outbreak could have been contained to the original facility. Instead, corporate negligence and government cover-ups turned a laboratory accident into a regional catastrophe. Near the end of our conversation, Whitaker started having trouble breathing. I could hear him struggling to get enough air to speak, pausing frequently to catch his breath. He told me he'd prepared copies of all the files he'd gathered, hidden them in locations around Seattle where other survivors might find them someday. His final transmission came through around midnight. Whitaker managed to give me coordinates for 3 locations where he'd hidden the document archives, along with access codes for the encrypted drives. His voice was barely audible by then, more like a whisper than normal speech. The transmission ended with sounds I'd rather not describe. I've been thinking about what Whitaker told me, trying to process the scope of what went wrong. This wasn't a natural disaster or an act of terrorism. It was human error and institutional failure on a massive scale. People in positions of trust made decisions that put profits and political considerations ahead of public safety, and now we're all paying the price. The hardest part is knowing that it didn't have to happen this way. If Meridian had followed proper safety protocols, if government oversight had been more than rubber stamping, if officials had prioritized transparency over damage control, maybe thousands of people would still be alive today. Maybe I'd still be working my regular job in Missoula instead of talking to empty air from a cabin in the mountains. But knowing the truth doesn't change our current situation. The spores are still out there, still spreading through contaminated areas. The medical infrastructure that might have developed treatments has collapsed along with everything else. Whitaker's information helps us understand how we got here, but it doesn't show us a way out. This is Michael Turner on KCMT, reminding you that sometimes the most important stories are the ones nobody wants you to hear. This is KCMT, day 125, and the first real snow hit yesterday. I've been dreading this moment for weeks now because winter changes everything up here. The solar panels are producing about half the power they did in September, and I'm burning through my fuel reserves faster than I planned. But that's not the worst part of what I need to tell you today. 3 weeks ago, I had to leave the cabin for supplies. My food stores were running lower than I was comfortable with, and the backup generator was making some concerning noises that meant it probably needed maintenance I couldn't do without parts. I'd been putting off this trip, hoping maybe I could stretch things until spring, but reality has a way of forcing your hand. The nearest town is Glacier Creek, about 15 miles down the mountain on old logging roads that haven't seen maintenance in years. Used to be a decent place, maybe 800 people, built around a lumber mill that closed down in the early 2000s. Most folks moved away after that, but there were still a few dozen families hanging on, running a general store, a gas station, that kind of thing. I loaded up my truck with empty fuel cans and a shopping list of everything I needed to make it through winter. The drive down was nerve-wracking because I hadn't seen another human being in over 2 months. Part of me was hoping I'd find other survivors, people who'd managed to avoid exposure and were holding out like I was. Another part of me was terrified of what I might actually find. Glacier Creek looked normal from a distance. Houses still standing, no obvious damage, cars parked in driveways like their owners just stepped inside for a minute. The illusion lasted until I got to the main street and started looking through windows. That's when I realized the cars weren't parked. They were abandoned, doors hanging open, keys still in ignitions. The general store was my first stop. Door was unlocked, shelves still mostly stocked with canned goods and basic supplies. I loaded up a cart with everything I could carry, but something felt wrong about the whole situation. Too quiet, too still, like the building was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the smell coming from the back office. I found the store owner, Mrs. Peterson, sitting at her desk like she was doing paperwork. Except she'd been dead for months, and that gray fungal growth had spread across her entire upper body. It looked almost like she was wearing some kind of strange sweater, except the threads were growing directly out of her skin. Her eyes were still open, staring at invoices that were scattered across the desktop. The gas station was worse. 3 people inside, including what looked like a family with a young kid. They died in their regular positions, the clerk behind the counter, the family standing near the snack aisle like they were deciding what to buy for a road trip. The fungal growth had connected them in some places, creating these web-like structures between their bodies and the shelving units. Every building I checked was the same. People who died where they stood, going about their normal business when the fungus finally claimed them. No signs of panic or struggle, just folks who'd run out of time. The really disturbing part was how peaceful it all looked, like they'd just decided to sit down and rest, not realizing they'd never get back up. I spent 2 days in Glacier Creek, loading supplies and trying to piece together what had happened. Found a doctor's office with medical records still scattered on the desk. Dr. Rachel Simmons had been documenting the progression of the fungus in her patients, right up until the end. Her notes showed she was treating herself with the same experimental therapies she was using on others. According to her records, the fungus doesn't kill you quickly. It spreads through your respiratory system over weeks or months, gradually replacing healthy tissue with its own structures. Patients remained conscious and functional for most of that time, just getting progressively weaker as their lung capacity decreased. The final stage happened fast, though. Once the fungal growth reached critical mass, people had maybe hours before complete respiratory failure. Dr. Simmons had calculated survival rates based on initial exposure levels and individual health factors. Healthy adults might last 8 to 12 weeks from first symptoms. Elderly or people with existing respiratory problems went faster, maybe 4 to 6 weeks. Children seemed to have some natural resistance, but even they succumbed eventually. The most chilling thing in her notes was a timeline she'd created for the town. She'd tracked the progression of the infection through the community, predicting when different families would reach terminal stages. Her calculations were accurate down to the week for most people. She'd essentially created a death schedule for everyone she knew. Her final entries were written in increasingly shaky handwriting as her own condition deteriorated. She described the psychological effects of knowing exactly how much time you had left, watching friends and neighbors reach their breaking points according to her predictions. Some people chose to end things early rather than wait for the fungus to finish its work. I found evidence of that in several houses. Folks who'd made their own decisions about when to go, rather than letting the infection run its full course. Dr. Simmons seemed to understand this choice. Her notes talked about the ethical implications of physician-assisted ending when conventional treatment wasn't possible. The hardest part of going through Glacier Creek was finding the school. It had been closed since early spring when the infection first reached the town, but someone had turned it into a makeshift medical facility. Rows of beds in the gymnasium, medical equipment that looked like it had been scavenged from the doctor's office, and the small clinic. Based on what I found there, it looked like the community had tried to care for their sick together, rather than letting people die alone in their homes. Dr. Simmons had set up a kind of hospice operation, making people as comfortable as possible in their final weeks. The beds were still occupied, families who'd chosen to face the end together. I've seen a lot of difficult things in my years doing emergency management, but walking through that gymnasium was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. These weren't strangers. I'd known some of these people. The Hendersons who ran the hardware store, the Martinez family who'd moved up from California a few years back. Good people who deserved better than what happened to them. The fuel I needed was at the gas station, but the pumps weren't working without electricity. Had to siphon what I could from abandoned vehicles, which gave me maybe half of what I'd hoped to collect. Found a portable generator at the hardware store that might help extend my power supply, along with enough parts to keep my own equipment running for a few more months. Loading the truck with supplies, I kept expecting to run into other survivors. Somebody had to have made it out, right? But every house I checked told the same story. People who'd tried to ride out the infection in their own homes, hoping maybe they'd be among the lucky few who survived. None of them were. The drive back up the mountain felt like leaving a graveyard. I kept looking in my mirrors, half expecting to see someone following me, maybe another survivor who'd been hiding and waiting for help to arrive. But the roads stayed empty, and by the time I reached the cabin, I was more alone than I'd ever been in my life. That was 3 weeks ago, and I've been processing what I saw ever since. The thing that haunts me most isn't the bodies or the fungal growth, it's how normal everything looked. People had maintained their routines right up to the end, going to work, running errands, taking care of their families. They'd faced their fate with a dignity that makes what happened to them even more tragic. Winter's settling in now, and I'm calculating my own timeline based on what Dr. Simmons documented. I've got enough supplies to last until March, maybe April if I'm careful. The generator I found should help stretch my power reserves, and I've sealed up the cabin as tight as I can manage. But I'm starting to understand that surviving the fungus might not be the biggest challenge anymore. The isolation is getting to me in ways I didn't expect. Going days without speaking to another human being, having entire conversations with myself just to hear a voice. I've started talking to my Uncle Ray, telling him about what's happening down in the valley, asking him what he thinks I should do next. Sometimes I swear I can hear him answering back. I've been monitoring the radio frequencies more obsessively than before, hoping to hear another voice, any voice that might indicate someone else made it through. Mostly it's just static and automated emergency broadcasts that nobody's updated in months. But yesterday I picked up something that might have been a person calling for help. Too faint to make out words, but definitely human. If there are other people out there, they're probably facing the same questions I am. How long do we keep fighting? What's the point of surviving if civilization isn't coming back? I don't have answers to those questions, but I keep getting up every morning and checking my equipment, maintaining my routines, broadcasting these messages into the void. This is Michael Turner on KCMT, reminding you that sometimes the hardest part of surviving isn't staying alive. It's finding a reason to want to. This is KCMT, day 160. And I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for weeks now. Remember that supply run I made to Glacier Creek? Well, I brought back more than just food and fuel. I've been watching a small gray patch on my left hand grow bigger every day, and I think my time for pretending this isn't happening is running out. It started as just a rough spot on my knuckle, something I figured was dry skin from the cold weather, but it's been spreading slowly across my hand, and the texture is exactly what Dr. Simmons described in her medical notes. I've got maybe 6 months if her calculations are right, maybe less. So I'm going to use whatever time I have left to tell you about the people I've been talking to and what they've taught me about how this whole thing is really ending. Daniel Hayes reached out to me about 3 weeks ago. He's a long-haul trucker who's been driving empty highways since this whole mess started, documenting what's happened to the towns and cities along his routes. His CB radio setup lets him cover more ground than most of us, and he's become kind of a traveling reporter for what's left of civilization. Hayes told me he's been driving the same route for 15 years, Interstate 80 from Sacramento to New York, with regular stops at truck stops and shipping centers that used to be the backbone of American commerce. Now he's watching that entire system shut down piece by piece, not from some dramatic collapse, but just from people not showing up to work anymore. His first major stop after everything started going bad was Reno, Nevada. He'd been delivering there monthly for over a decade, knew the loading dock crews by name, had regular conversations with the warehouse managers about sports and weather and local news. When he arrived in early June, the facility was completely abandoned. Loading docks standing open, cargo containers scattered around the yard like someone had just stopped mid-task and walked away. Hayes described walking through the warehouse, finding personal belongings left at workstations, coffee cups still sitting on desks, family photos tacked to bulletin boards, someone's lunch still in the break room refrigerator. It looked like a normal workday that had just been interrupted, except nobody was coming back to finish what they'd started. The truck stops along his route told the same story. Places that used to be bustling with drivers, mechanics, and travelers now sitting empty, except for abandoned vehicles in the parking lots. Hayes would pull in looking for fuel or supplies, find the pumps turned off, and the buildings locked up tight. Sometimes he'd see evidence that people had tried to keep things running for a while. Handwritten signs apologizing for limited services, notices about reduced hours that kept getting more and more restrictive. What really got to Hayes was the gradual nature of it all. These places didn't shut down overnight because of some catastrophic event. They just slowly lost staff as people got sick or stopped showing up until there wasn't anyone left to keep the lights on. He described finding one truck stop in Utah where someone had left a note on the door explaining they were the last employee and couldn't stay any longer because their family needed them at home. Hayes has been documenting abandoned cities from coast to coast. Not the big metropolitan areas that made the news, but smaller places that just quietly faded away as their populations dwindled. He drove through towns in Kansas and Nebraska that looked completely normal from the highway. Streetlights still working, grass still being cut by automated systems. But when he got closer, he could see there was nobody actually living there anymore. The most disturbing thing he found was in a town called Millerville, somewhere in central Illinois. Population maybe 3,000 people, built around a grain processing facility that employed half the town. Hayes stopped there because he needed to check his tire pressure. Figured he'd grab a meal at the diner he'd eaten at dozens of times before. The diner was open, lights on, coffee still hot in the pot behind the counter, but there was nobody there to serve him. Hayes waited around for maybe 20 minutes, thinking someone had just stepped out for a minute, but nobody showed up. That's when he started noticing details that didn't make sense. Meals half-eaten at several tables, like customers had just stood up and left in the middle of eating. He walked through the whole town after that, knocking on doors, calling out, trying to find somebody who could explain what had happened. Every house he checked was the same. Doors unlocked, lights on, signs of recent activity, but no actual people anywhere. Cars in driveways, bicycles left on front lawns, mail still being delivered to empty mailboxes by automated postal trucks. Hayes spent 2 days in Millerville trying to piece together what had happened. found medical records at the local clinic showing the same progression of fungal infections that Dr. Simmons had documented in Glacier Creek. But unlike other places where people had died in their homes or in makeshift medical facilities, the residents of Millerville seemed to have just left. All at once, all in the same direction, walking out of town on foot and never coming back. He followed the trail for about 10 miles outside town before losing it at a river crossing. No bodies, no abandoned belongings, just footprints in the mud that disappeared at the water's edge. Hayes couldn't figure out what would make an entire community abandon everything they owned and walk away together. It wasn't panic or fear. Their belongings were left neatly arranged, doors locked behind them, like they were just going out for a group walk and planned to return. That was when Hayes started noticing a pattern in other abandoned places. Communities where people hadn't died in their homes but had apparently gathered together and left as a group. Always on foot, always heading toward water, rivers, lakes, sometimes just seasonal creeks that might be dry by now. Hayes began mapping these migration routes, trying to understand why people in their final stages would make these coordinated journeys. His theory, based on what he's observed, is that the fungal infection affects decision-making in the final stages. Not mind control like in the movies, but subtle changes in behavior that make people want to be near water and in groups with others who are similarly affected. He's found evidence of these gatherings at dozens of locations, camps set up near rivers and lakes, abandoned when the final stage of the infection set in. Matthew Grant contacted me around the same time I started talking to Hayes. Grant's been holed up in a subway maintenance facility under Manhattan, using the underground utility tunnels to move around the city without being exposed to surface air. His reports from New York paint a picture of a metropolis slowly going dark, one neighborhood at a time. According to Grant, the city's infrastructure is still mostly functional. Power plants are running on automation, water treatment facilities are processing sewage from a population that's mostly gone. Subway trains are running their scheduled routes with no passengers. It's like the mechanical systems don't understand that there's nobody left to serve. Grant described riding empty subway cars through tunnels that used to carry millions of commuters daily. The stations are exactly as they were left. Advertising posters still promoting movies that never got wide release. Electronic signs still displaying arrival times for trains that nobody boards. He said the silence is the worst part. Not the absence of voices, but the absence of life itself. His work maintaining the underground systems has taken him through areas of the city that most people never see. Service tunnels, utility corridors, the mechanical spaces that keep a major city running. What he's found there suggests that some city workers kept doing their jobs right up until the very end, maintaining critical systems even as they knew nobody would be around to benefit from their work. Grant found maintenance logs showing repairs and inspections conducted weeks after the surface population had largely disappeared. Water pressure readings taken daily, electrical load balancing performed on schedule, even routine cleaning of equipment that hadn't been used in months. It was like the workers understood their city was dying, but couldn't bring themselves to abandon their responsibilities. The most haunting thing Grant described was finding a subway control room where the operators had maintained service schedules right until they physically couldn't continue. Their final log entries showed trains being dispatched on time to stations that no longer had any passengers, with notes about maintaining proper intervals and safety protocols for a transit system that was essentially running for ghosts. Olivia Parker has been broadcasting from a farm in central Iowa, one of the last agricultural operations still trying to function. She's been documenting the collapse of food production systems across the Midwest, watching as automated farming equipment continues harvesting crops that nobody's around to process or distribute. Parker inherited the farm from her family and has been trying to keep it running even though there's no market for what she produces. Her combines are still cutting grain, her irrigation systems are still watering fields, but the grain elevators and processing facilities that would normally buy her harvest have been abandoned. She's essentially farming for a civilization that no longer exists. What Parker's reports make clear is how interconnected our food systems really were. Her farm might still be productive, but without truckers like Hayes to move the grain, without processing facilities to turn it into food products, without stores to sell it to consumers, her crops just rot in storage buildings that nobody will ever empty. She's documented the shutdown of agricultural support services across a region that used to feed much of the country. Seed suppliers, equipment dealers, veterinary services, all the businesses that made modern farming possible have closed their doors as their customer base disappeared. Parker's been trying to save seeds for next year's planting, but she's not sure there will be anyone left to benefit from her preparation. The loneliness in Parker's broadcasts is something I understand completely. She's surrounded by thousands of acres of productive farmland, but she might as well be on another planet for all the human contact she has. Like me, she keeps talking to her radio because it's the only way to prove to herself that she still exists, that her voice still matters even if nobody's listening. Benjamin Ross has been transmitting from a Coast Guard station in Maine, monitoring shipping channels that don't carry ships anymore. His equipment can track vessels across the entire North Atlantic, and his reports describe a maritime system that's slowly grinding to a halt as ports close and crews abandon their ships. Ross documented the final commercial flight that landed at Portland International Jetport in late September. A cargo plane from Europe that had been diverted from Boston when Logan Airport stopped responding to air traffic control. The plane landed safely, but there was nobody available to unload it or service it for the return trip. It's still sitting on the tarmac, along with a dozen other aircraft that arrived after ground crews had stopped showing up for work. His monitoring equipment picked up distress signals from cargo ships stranded at sea when their destination ports went silent. Some of these vessels are still out there, broadcasting automated emergency beacons from locations where their crews probably succumbed to the infection weeks ago. Ross has been maintaining a log of these signals, tracking ships that are now essentially floating tombs drifting with the currents. All of these people, Hayes, Grant, Parker, Ross, they're facing the same questions I am. How long do we keep maintaining systems that serve nobody? What's the purpose of preserving civilization when there might not be anyone left to rebuild it? These aren't academic questions anymore. They're daily decisions about whether to get up in the morning and continue routines that feel increasingly meaningless. This is Michael Turner on KCMT, asking you to remember that the end of the world doesn't come with explosions and dramatic music. It comes with people just quietly stopping what they're doing and walking away. This is KCMT, day 220, and this is probably going to be my final broadcast. The fungal infection has reached my chest now, and I can feel my breathing getting more labored each day. I've got maybe a week left, maybe 2 if I'm lucky. But before I sign off for the last time, I need to tell you about Christopher Reed and what he found at the source of all this. Reed contacted me 6 weeks ago from inside the Cascade Neurological Institute, that converted warehouse where Meridian Biotech conducted their trials. He's been trapped there since the beginning, a security guard who got locked inside when the facility went into emergency containment. For 8 months, he's been the only living person in the building where humanity's end began. When Reed first reached out, I thought maybe he had answers. Someone who'd been at ground zero, who might have access to research that could help the few of us still breathing. But what he told me over our weeks of conversation was worse than anything I'd imagined. The people who created this disaster knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway. Reed had been working security at the Institute for about 2 years before everything went wrong. Standard stuff, checking IDs, monitoring cameras, making sure unauthorized people didn't wander into restricted areas. He thought he was guarding legitimate medical research, maybe some cutting-edge pharmaceutical development that needed extra protection from corporate espionage. The truth was darker. Reed found Dr. Lauren Evans's private files after spending months breaking into locked offices and encrypted computer systems. Evans had been the lead researcher on the Cordyceps project, and her personal notes revealed that the human trials weren't about developing antidepressants at all. They were testing biological weapons. The depression treatment angle was just cover for a Defense Department contract to develop what they called incapacitating agents, weapons that could disable enemy populations without the political complications of traditional warfare. The idea was to create something that would spread through a population, making them docile and manageable, rather than killing them outright. Evans's research notes described the perfect weapon, something that would spread naturally, couldn't be easily detected or treated, and would leave infrastructure intact while eliminating human resistance. The Cordyceps fungus was ideal because it already knew how to manipulate host behavior in insects. They just needed to adapt it for human physiology. The early trials were successful beyond their expectations. Test subjects became increasingly compliant as the infection progressed, losing the will to resist or fight back. They remained conscious and functional for weeks, but their decision-making became passive, focused on basic survival rather than complex planning or organized resistance. Reed found video recordings of the final trials, stored on secure servers that kept running long after the facility was abandoned. Watching those recordings, he said, was like seeing the moment humanity sealed its own fate. Researchers celebrating breakthrough results while test subjects sat quietly in observation rooms, their personalities slowly dissolving as the fungus established itself in their nervous systems. The contamination that spread to hospitals wasn't an accident. It was the inevitable result of researchers who prioritized their weapons program over basic safety protocols. Evans's notes showed they knew the fungus was highly contagious, but they continued the trials because the military applications were too valuable to abandon. When the first test subject died and contaminated medical equipment started the wider outbreak, Evans and her team had a choice. They could have immediately alerted health authorities, provided information about the fungus's properties, maybe helped develop containment protocols that could have limited the spread. Instead, they chose to destroy evidence and disappear. Reed found Evans's final log entry, recorded just before she and the other researchers evacuated the facility. She talked about the infection spreading beyond their control, but her main concern was avoiding responsibility for what they'd created. The research team scattered to different countries, taking new identities and leaving no information behind that could help medical authorities understand what they were dealing with. That's why early medical responses were so ineffective. Doctors were trying to treat an unknown fungal infection without understanding its engineered properties. The standard antifungal medications that might have helped in the early stages were never tried because nobody knew what they were dealing with. By the time researchers like Emily Brooks figured out the true nature of the infection, it was too late to implement effective treatments. Reed spent months going through Evans's research, trying to understand if there might still be hope for survivors like us. What he found was a detailed analysis of the fungus's progression that made clear why there wouldn't be any last-minute cures or miraculous recoveries. The infection was designed to be irreversible once it established itself in human tissue. The most disturbing thing Reed discovered was evidence that the research team had developed a preventative treatment, something that could stop the infection if administered before exposure or in the very early stages. Evans's files contained formulation notes for what she called an immunization protocol, but that information was classified at the highest levels and never shared with medical authorities. Reed tried to synthesize the prevention treatment using equipment left behind in the laboratory, but he lacked the expertise and materials needed for the complex biochemical processes involved. He spent weeks attempting to follow Evans's protocols, but without proper training and specialized ingredients, his efforts just resulted in batches of useless chemical soup. That was when Reed realized the cruel irony of his situation. He was sitting in a facility that contained all the research needed to prevent the infection, but he didn't have the knowledge to use it. The people who could have implemented the treatment were either dead or had disappeared into hiding. The information existed, but it was useless without the experts who'd created it. Reed's final weeks in the facility were spent documenting everything he could find, creating a complete record of the research program that destroyed civilization. He found financial records showing payments from defense contractors, correspondence with government officials discussing deployment scenarios, even target lists of cities where they'd planned to test the weaponized fungus in controlled field trials. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. This wasn't just one rogue research facility. It was a coordinated program involving multiple agencies and contractors. Reed found evidence of similar research being conducted at sites across the country, all working toward the goal of developing biological weapons that could end conflicts without destroying valuable infrastructure. What happened at the Cascade Institute was supposed to be the final proof of concept before moving to larger scale testing. Evans's team was preparing to demonstrate their weapons' effectiveness to military officials, using volunteer subjects recruited from local homeless populations and psychiatric facilities. People who wouldn't be missed if something went wrong. But something did go wrong, in a way that exposed the fundamental flaw in their approach. You can't create a biological weapon that only affects your enemies. Once released, even in controlled conditions, pathogens follow their own logic. The fungus didn't care about national boundaries or military objectives. It just spread to every available host until there weren't any left to infect. Reed's final transmission came through 3 weeks ago, and it was barely audible through the static. He'd been coughing blood for days, he said, and the fungal growth had reached his throat. But he'd managed to compile everything he'd found onto a single drive, along with enough documentation to prove what really happened at the Institute. He gave me coordinates for a dead drop location where he'd hidden the drive, someplace outside the facility where other survivors might eventually find it. Reed said he wanted people to know that this wasn't a natural disaster or an unavoidable tragedy. It was a deliberate choice made by people who valued military advantage over human survival. His final words were an apology. Reed felt responsible for what happened because he'd been working security for the facility, even though he hadn't known what kind of research was being conducted there. He'd spent his last months trying to make up for his unwitting participation in humanity's end, documenting the truth that might help future survivors understand what went wrong. I've been thinking about Reed's story ever since, trying to process what it means. We're not dealing with the consequences of scientific hubris or corporate negligence. This was biological warfare that got out of control. The people who created the fungus knew it would kill millions, and they did it anyway because they thought they could control the spread. The other survivors I've been talking to over these months, Hayes, Grant, Parker, Ross, they're all gone now. Their transmissions stopped one by one as the infection reached its final stages. I'm probably the last voice left on these frequencies, talking to empty air and automated systems that will keep running long after there's nobody left to hear them. My own condition has deteriorated rapidly over the past week. The fungal growth has spread across most of my upper body, and breathing is becoming a struggle. I can feel the infection affecting my thinking too, not controlling my mind like in the movies, but making it harder to concentrate, easier to just sit and stare at nothing for hours at a time. I've prepared everything I can for whoever might eventually find this place. All the documents I've collected, the recordings of my conversations with other survivors, Reed's coordinates for the research files, it's all stored in a fireproof safe along with a solar-powered radio beacon that will keep broadcasting their location for years. Maybe someday, someone will piece together the complete story of what happened to us. Maybe they'll learn from our mistakes, develop better safeguards against the kind of research that destroyed civilization. Or maybe they'll just use the information to create even more effective weapons. I don't know, and I'm not sure it matters anymore. What I do know is that we were betrayed by the institutions we trusted to protect us. The government agencies that were supposed to ensure our safety, the researchers who were supposed to advance human knowledge, the corporations that were supposed to serve the public good, they all chose their own interests over human survival. The fungus might have been the immediate cause of our extinction, but the real disease was the willingness of people in power to sacrifice everyone else for their own advantage. That's the lesson that matters, if anyone's left to learn it. I'm going to keep broadcasting as long as I can, but my voice is getting weaker and the equipment is starting to fail. The solar panels are covered with snow that I don't have the strength to clear, and the backup batteries are nearly drained. When this transmission ends, it might be the last human voice these frequencies will ever carry. If you're somehow listening to this, if you managed to survive what we couldn't, remember us not as victims, but as people who tried to maintain our dignity even when everything fell apart. We documented the truth, supported each other across impossible distances, and kept talking even when nobody seemed to be listening. The automated emergency broadcast system will keep cycling through its warnings and instructions long after I'm gone. But it won't tell you what really happened, or why it happened, or who was responsible for turning our world into a graveyard. That's what these broadcasts were for, to make sure somebody remembered the whole story, not just the official version. This is Michael Turner, signing off from KCMT for the last time. Keep the frequency clear, and remember that the greatest tragedies aren't the ones that happen to us. They're the ones we do to ourselves.